Recardo Wimbush was born April 3, 1981, and grew up in a town 3 hours south of Atlanta, Georgia. Throughout his early years, he would receive multiple awards for his talents playing football, and would go on to attend Georgia Tech, starring as a linebacker for the Yellow Jackets, where he received many sporting accolades. During his 4-year career at Tech, Recardo had met his wife, Therian Wimbush, in August of 1999. Therian Wimbush was studying mechanical engineering at Georgia Tech and was a few years older than Recardo. On top of her studies, she would tutor other students and athletes on many different subjects and was regarded as one of the brightest in her class. The two got married and would go on to have a large family of 10 children. After graduating from Tech, Recardo obtained a job in a railroad to support the family, whilst his wife Therian homeschooled the children. The family lived in a large 5-bedroom house in Buford, Georgia, and were known to be incredibly religious, as both Therian and Recardo were members of the strict movement called the Way of Yah. A neighbor of theirs had said in an interview, quote, "They were a very odd family. All the children were nicely dressed, but never allowed to be sociable. You would never see the children outside playing unless they were out as an entire family and both parents were watching. They seemed like strict disciplinarians. They didn't celebrate Christmas or Halloween. If a child in the area knocked on their door for trick-or-treat, they would be handed a Bible instead of candy. One time, they had a note on their door that blew into my yard which read, 'Those who work on Sunday should be put to death.'" End quote. The homeschooled children, who didn't have much to do with the outer world, still had many forms of stimulation and entertainment in their house. They had an abundance of books, toys, movies, and even an entire room dedicated to Lego. The siblings all played together and were very close with one another. 9 of the children all slept in the master bedroom that had 9 individual beds, and the parents slept in a separate room with their newborn child. At some point during 2014, an anonymous call was placed alerting authorities that a child was being held captive in the basement of the house. Upon investigation, the Wimbushes' eldest son, Recardo Jr., was found in a locked closet downstairs, and another one of their sons, Isaiah, was suffering from an enormous skin cancer tumor, which had been growing on his abdomen for years. This led to the parents losing custody over all of their children and facing charges for cruelty, neglect, and abuse. In the trial for these crimes, the parents elected to represent themselves over a state-appointed defense attorney.
Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to first tell you that I am not an attorney. And just like David, that ruddy little Hebrew shepherd boy, when he went up against Goliath, refused King Saul's armor because he had not tested it, I do not seek to put on the mantle of an attorney. I'm just like all of you, a layperson. The only difference is that I'm accused of a crime, and you are not. Or that I am dressed in Gwinnett County Jail issue greens, and you are dressed in regular clothes. It is easier to believe a lie than it is to believe the truth. Let me say that again. It is easier to believe a lie than it is to believe the truth. So let's talk about the lie on paper. We have in no way caused either of our 10 biological children cruel and excessive mental nor physical pain. So now I have a mission for each of you. Look to your inner childlike spirit and treat this trial like a scavenger hunt, where you are the fact finders, even the truth seekers, seeking to find the pieces to the puzzle that describes cruelty to children, and I will ask you to return a verdict of not guilty. Before I close, I'd like to address the opening statement by the state. He gave you a description of our life. Definitely our homeschooling parents. Trying to think of everything that he said. He was telling our story. All of our children share one bedroom, the master bedroom. And I'll tell you, the state is correct. At some point, Recardo decided that his room would be in the basement. Did his parents send him down there to stay? No, they didn't. He made a choice. And that choice was his. Was he forced to stay in a room without social interaction or without mental stimulation? No, he wasn't. But Recardo was disobedient in some ways. In those ways, I'll let him tell you. I'll let him tell you his story. I'll let him tell you his facts, his justifications, his reasonings, so that you can decide. Thank you.
Throughout this trial, all of the Wimbush children were called to the stand to testify, having to answer questions from both the state's prosecutor and their parents. During these testimonies, they were held in another room and spoke with the family via digital means. Their faces were not allowed to be filmed, and Recardo Jr., the boy who was found in the closet, was the first to take the stand.
Your parents are going to have the chance to ask you some questions now. Is that all right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Ricardo.
Hey, handsome.
Help us out. You usually speak a little bit louder, so I just want to make sure we can hear you.
Hey, handsome. How are you doing?
Okay. Good.
Now I'm going to ask you some questions. It's so good to see your face and that voice. I'm going to take you back a little bit. Tell me, how did you learn how to play basketball?
I think you taught me.
Did you ever play basketball outside with your parents?
Yes.
Where'd you play?
In the backyard.
In the backyard. Did you ever take tumbling?
Yes.
Did you ever take gymnastics?
Yes.
Did you ever do karate?
Yes.
Do you remember the place that you did karate at?
Yes.
What was the name of it?
Dojo.
The dojo, yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about before your room got moved down to the basement. Do you remember things that you were doing prior to that? Do you remember inappropriately touching your siblings?
Objection, Your Honor. The witnesses answered no, that he did not recall.
Do you remember ever doing anything to harm your siblings?
Yes.
Are you okay with talking about that right now?
No.
No? Okay, understood. Do you remember being in Florida in the swimming pool at the hotel?
Yes.
Yes. Do you remember what happened that day?
Yes.
Okay, will you tell us about what happened that day?
I had almost drowned because you had asked me if I had needed help while I was on one of the floaties, and I said no. And I had floated into the deep end and fell off of the floaty.
So you remember me asking you right as you were falling, do you need help?
Yes.
And what did you say?
No.
Why did you say that and you knew you needed help?
Because I wanted to try and do things on my own.
And what happened after that?
I had fell off and almost drowned.
And who saved you that day?
You did.
A reoccurring pattern emerges in Therian's questioning of her son. She appears to believe that Recardo Jr. has an elevated sense of pride, and that this pride led him to not asking for help in the water that day. It would appear that this belief runs in conjunction with her view that he is a compulsive liar, something that is most noticeable upon the testimonies of the Wimbush's other children.
Do you remember Ricardo growing up?
A little bit.
What was Ricardo like?
He didn't always tell the truth.
Didn't always tell the truth.
Do you have a sibling that used to get in trouble a lot?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Can you tell me who that sibling is?
Ricardo,
And do you remember why he would get in trouble?
because he lied. He got speaking because he didn't tell the truth all the time.
Do you remember why Ricardo's room was in the basement?
Because he was lying. Because he was lying.
He was what?
He was not telling the truth.
He was not telling the truth. Was he doing anything else?
He was stealing food.
He was what?
Stealing food.
Stealing food. Let me ask you a question. Do you remember why Ricardo's room was in the basement?
I remember that he lied a lot, and he didn't really want to tell the truth, and y'all had discussed it, and he said that he would rather go in the basement and get whoopings.
Okay. Very detailed answer. Thank you.
Each child that was interviewed said they didn't really remember why Recardo Jr. had gone to the basement, other than he lied a lot and he got beaten a lot. They say that he chose to go to the basement to avoid future beatings, and all of the children testify to this except for one of their girls. Her name is Hope Wimbush. Hope appears to have a more detailed recollection of why Recardo Jr. had moved downstairs.
Do you remember Ricardo doing anything else?
He violated some of our siblings' privacy.
And what do you mean by that?
He inappropriately touched some of them.
Okay.
He violated their personal parts.
Okay.
Oh, I'm damned. We've never met before, but hi. You seem like a very smart young lady to me. Where did you learn the term violated their personal privacy?
What do you mean by that question?
Well, you said that Ricardo violated the privacy of some siblings. I was just wondering where you heard the term violated their personal privacy. You know where you heard that term?
No.
Is that something y'all have discussed in the family where you live now?
No.
The prosecutor seems suspicious of whether Hope was actually present when Ricardo Jr. is said to have touched his siblings, but he does not press the young girl to dig into these memories. As the trial moves along, there appears to be a confusion surrounding the exact date and reason for why Ricardo Jr. was sent downstairs to the basement. None of the children can really remember an exact incident for when he was moved, and his parents say that he did have a choice to go down there, and that he made the decision to move to the basement so that he no longer would get the beatings that he hated so much. Beatings that he was receiving frequently due to his lying. And the things that it is claimed that he would lie about was taking food when he wasn't meant to, and playing games or reading books without permission, then denying that he did these things. Some of his siblings recall that when Ricardo Jr. was in trouble, he would wet the bed at night, and in the morning he would lie about this to his parents, which would land him in even more trouble. But here lies the confusion. The parents also say that they moved him down there to separate him from the siblings that he was molesting, that they moved him to protect their other children. Whatever the reason is, Ricardo Jr. is moved downstairs, and he himself also appears confused as to why he is moved there. At times, he testifies that he was moved downstairs because he was lying. There are other times during his testimony that he says it was his choice to go down because he didn't want to get the beatings. Then he also says that he thinks it was because he may have touched his siblings. But the most common answer he gives is that he doesn't remember why he was moved down there at all. Whichever the reason may be, in August of 2012, Ricardo Jr. had begun living in the basement.
Did we say that you had to stay in the basement? That your room had to stay in the basement?
That's what I remember.
Okay. Do you remember having conversations with Mommy about you coming back upstairs?
Yes.
Yes. So when your mommy would ask you if you were ready to come back upstairs, what would you say?
I think I said no.
And
I'm not sure.
Yeah, you did. Do you know why you would have said no?
Because I didn't think that you wanted me back upstairs.
Okay.
Attached to the basement is a small room called the Blue Room. It is a very small closet and is the only other room that Ricardo Jr. would have access to throughout the long days that he would be down there alone. On the wall in this closet, Therian paints the word pride with large letters, and there are a range of smaller printed words around it.
Do you remember talking about that word pride that was on the wall?
Yes.
And the acronyms that were on the wall with the word pride. Will you talk about those? I don't know how much of that you remember at this point, but will you talk about pride, as you said, as acronyms?
They were characteristics of pride.
Characteristics of pride. Is pride a dangerous thing to have?
It depends on how and when the feeling of pride is.
Is it so? Let's use an example of if somebody's about to drown and they know they need help and they don't ask for it. Is that a dangerous time to have pride?
Yes.
When you just, so should that person just ask for help?
Yes.
Recardo Jr. is not allowed upstairs during the daytime and is unable to interact with his siblings or get anything to entertain himself. Sometimes his siblings would come down to visit him, but these events were rather rare. One night, to relieve the boredom, Recardo Jr. sneaks upstairs and grabs a portable DVD player so that he could watch a movie whilst everyone else slept.
Do you remember hiding the DVD player behind the rocking chair in the basement, in your room?
Yes.
Were you allowed to watch movies?
Yes. When you ask for permission.
Why didn't you ask for permission to watch movies?
Because I was always afraid that you would say no.
You were afraid that I would say no. I understand. Did you get in trouble a lot about not asking for permission?
Yes.
Do you remember the other one thing that you got in trouble for the most?
Lying.
Lying. Will you tell us why you lied, Ricardo?
Because I never wanted to get in trouble.
You never wanted to get in trouble. Did you feel like the truth would get you in trouble?
Yes.
So were you doing things wrong that you felt like the truth would get you in trouble?
Yes.
So can I ask you this? How were you doing things that were wrong?
I don't remember.
Understood.
A few more incidents like this happen, where Recardo Jr. sneaks upstairs and takes a book and some food, and he receives punishment for both of these. His parents tell him at one point that they wish to use the basement now and he can no longer live in it, so they move his bed into the tiny closet that I mentioned earlier called the Blue Room. This room is barely big enough to fit the bed itself and has one window that looks out into the yard. Recardo Jr. is told that he is not allowed to leave the room without his parents' permission. One night, again, Recardo Jr. sneaks upstairs to get food, and on this occasion, his father catches him in the act. This results in a severe beating using a belt, where he was hit between 30 and 40 times. Due to this incident, Recardo Jr. is afraid that there will be more consequences to come. So the next night, on August 22nd, 2012, he takes a sleeping bag as his only item and runs away from the house. After wandering aimlessly for 45 minutes, someone spots him hanging around the front of their residence and contacts the police to report a suspicious person.
I saw the kid walking down the road with a sleeping bag. I made contact with him. I asked him, first off, what's your name? He said, I don't know. I said, okay, where are you coming from? He said, I'm coming from an orphanage. I asked how long he'd been walking. He first stated he'd been walking on the streets for 2 months, living off of water and food from passerbyers. He gave me the names of Mike Darvin with a date of birth of 9/13/2012, Mike Darwin, 9/13/2012, and Kashawn Richards, 3/11/2000. Upon running these in GCIC, which is our database, I was unable to get any kind of information about the kid's identity. When I put him in the back of the patrol car, he finally gave me his real name, which is Recardo Wimbush, and his date of birth, which I was able to, and he gave me his mother's phone number. I contact the mother, and I advise her, hey, I have your son on the side of the road. He's giving me a false name. I need you to come claim custody of this child.
Therian collects Ricardo from the police station, and he is taken home, then put straight back into the closet. As a result of him running away, they apply a sliding lock to the outside of the door and lock him in. This is where Recardo Jr. now stays for the next 18 long months. White paint is applied to the outside of the window so Ricardo cannot see what is going on in the outside world, and the light bulb for the room is removed from its fixture. Ricardo Jr. states that the room would get incredibly dark, especially on days where there was cloud coverage blocking the sun. His parents would bring him food once or twice a day, and this consisted of oats, rice, bread, and tuna. At these times, when his food was delivered, he was escorted to the downstairs bathroom to relieve himself. If he was unable to wait for these bathroom visits, he was given a plastic jar that he could use whilst he waited for them to come down. Over time, his bed sheets became moldy from the humidity and were removed but not replaced. He wore a tank top and some underwear that were too small for him, and not only was he not able to change these clothes, but he was unable to shower or bathe himself for the entire 18-month duration. His skin had mold and fungus growing on it, and there was a pile of hair and muck building up around the floor where the bed was. He did not exercise, was not provided any books, toys, or entertainment, and would often lay on the bed and listen to his siblings having fun and playing upstairs, which he could hear clearly. Recardo Jr. says that he would wish that he could be up there playing with them, and for that entire period in the closet, he didn't see his siblings once. His muscles deteriorated, and he suffered from a severe lack of vitamin D. Due to boredom, he would scratch at the paint on the walls, which damaged his nails, and doing this landed him in more trouble with his parents. The only stimulation he had was that word pride written on the wall, with the many words related to it surrounding. Whilst Recardo Jr. is on the stand, his mother continues to question him about this period of his life when he lived in the closet.
Do you remember your mommy calling you handsome?
Yes.
Do you remember your mommy calling you phenomenal?
Yes.
Where did you come up with the estimate that your room was in the basement for 2 years? How did you arrive at that estimate?
It was just a guess because I didn't know like time and stuff from being in that room.
Okay. Are you afraid of your mommy and daddy?
No.
Do you remember your mommy ever telling you, Ricardo, you can't stay down here forever?
Yes.
You said that you wanted to be upstairs with everybody else playing. Couldn't you have just told mommy and daddy that you wanted to come back upstairs?
I could have.
And you didn't?
No.
That's all I have. Thank you so much. I love you, handsome.
All right, Mr. Mayfield, redirect.
No, Your Honor.
It is unknown who reported the call, but the child abuse hotline was contacted and tipped that there was a child who was being kept in the basement closet of this house. On the 15th of June 2014, a Department of Family and Children's Services representative visits the residence.
She invited me into the home and ushered me into an office that was right by the front door. And then she told me Mr. Wimbush would be right there. And so Mr. Wimbush came, and the three of us sat in the office and talked for about 2 hours. Mrs. Wimbush reported that she followed Jesus for 8 years, and Jesus taught forgiveness. And at some point she decided that Ricardo did not deserve forgiveness anymore. And so according to her beliefs from the Old Testament, when someone commits a sin, they should be separated and they should have to pay restitution. So he was sent down to the basement to separate from the family as a punishment for his behavior.
Did she indicate to you how long that he had been in the basement?
She said she wasn't exactly sure. It was maybe about 2 years or 18 months. When we talked about education, I asked specifically if the child was receiving any schooling. And Mrs. Wimbush said he was being taught ethics because that was what he needed to learn, and that he wasn't receiving any other kind of math or English or any kind of other schooling while he was there, since he violated the rules.
All right.
Mrs. Wimbush took me downstairs to the basement, and she showed me the room, and I could see there was a door, and there were holes in the door that looked as if a lock had been removed. Then she called him out, and he came out, and I spoke with him. And then I observed the room, and I asked him if I could take pictures of him in the room, and he said I could, and so I took pictures. He said that he was disobedient, and that he deserved to be down there, and he was really hoping that he would be able to reintegrate into his family in October of that year, which was about 4 months later, because the family was having a Hebrew feast in October. And his mom told him that if he was really good, maybe he would be able to rejoin the family in October. And he was very hopeful because he wanted to see his siblings.
Ricardo Jr. is taken from the home, where forensic and psychological interviews are conducted.
I asked him where he wanted to go. He said he wanted to go to Burger King. And so I took him to Burger King and I asked him what he wanted, and he said he wanted a Whopper. So I got him the Whopper meal, and we went through the drive-thru, and I was driving him to his placement. And he ate that he ate every crumb of that meal, and he wouldn't speak while he was just eating. He seemed just really excited to have that meal, and he ate every crumb of that meal. And when we got in front of the building, there were 5 concrete steps that went up into the building, and he stopped, and he looked at the steps, and he really paused and thought for a little while, and then he held on to the rail and really made an effort to negotiate how to climb those 5 steps up into the building.
He told me that he had inappropriately touched 3 of his siblings, and his mother told him that his mother had made the decision to keep him away from his siblings as a result of that. I questioned him about whether he had in fact done that and what he remembered about that. He did not appear to have any recollection of ever having done anything like that, but it was something that he was told that he had done. Recardo Wimbush Jr. absolutely wants to go back home to his parents. And sometimes when you speak with him, he would even be willing to go back to the basement and back to being locked in the basement to obtain that outcome.
He did have an evaluation subsequently about sexual interests, and there was nothing abnormal. The psychosexual evaluation was normal.
So he showed no deviance, no predisposition to molestations whatsoever.
Correct. That he didn't. Yes, that's correct. There was nothing later that suggested that he was at any risk for doing such things in the future. Was really what it was for.
Okay. Do sometimes smaller children engage in that activity without any sort of malicious intent?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's, when I was a kid, they called it playing doctor, and it was quite common and is, in fact, quite common still. 11, 12, 13 are critical times in adolescent development. Early adolescence is the time when kids normally are getting a sense of who they are. They're starting to feel more separate from their family. They're pursuing their own interests. They're shifting a lot of their emotional energy to relationships with peers. So all of that he couldn't do.
In the future, doctor, will his relationships and his happiness be affected by what happened during this vital time in his life?
In my opinion, absolutely, yes.
No other questions?
You said Recardo doesn't ask for things. Could that be related to a sense of pride in that one does not want to ask for things?
It could be, but I didn't think it was with him. With him, it seemed more an inhibition rather than a sort of, I can do it myself kind of attitude.
If I told you, or if you knew, that Recardo didn't like to ask for things and even almost drowned because he didn't want to ask for help prior to all of these instances, would that change your thoughts about it being inhibitive?
Probably not.
Probably not. Okay.
Dr. Ash, so if, for instance, a child, say, inappropriately touches their sibling and then they're told that's not the right thing to do, and then they do it again, then what would be your recommendation?
Well, it's still a matter of you have to evaluate the child and see if you can understand what's going on from the child's point of view. What are they thinking about when they're doing it? What does this mean? And then once you have that information, then you're in a position to say, okay, well, the way to manage it is whatever.
And then if they continuously do that, then what?
Well, if they're actually molesting other children, you have to have an intervention that protects the other child. But what that is highly variable depending on the nature of the situations. I mean,
if that were all true, is the appropriate intervention ever to lock them in a room for 18 months?
No.
No other questions?
Shortly after these evaluations are complete, an arrest warrant is put out for both parents, and they turn themselves into law enforcement. All 10 children are placed into foster care, and they have zero contact with their parents for the 31 months up until this trial. There is an opinion that says the reason that the parents chose to represent themselves in court and reject public attorneys was so that they could have communication with their children. If I am to entertain this opinion, the evidence to support it is most prominent during the mother's examination of her children during their testimonies.
Hey, Gracie. Hey, Mr. Jeremiah. Your man who? How are you?
Good.
Good. And you're doing good in school?
Yeah.
And school is good?
Yeah.
And everything is good?
Yeah.
Do you remember which one of your siblings at home, when you were at home, which one of your siblings used to get in trouble a lot?
I don't know.
You don't know? Did you get in trouble a lot? Hey, love, how are you doing?
Good.
Good. Where's your playmat? Hello, Miss Hope.
Hi, Mommy.
How are you doing?
Good.
Good. How is school going?
Okay.
Okay, what does okay mean?
I got 1 C.
You got a C? Were you disappointed about that? Know how that feels. Hey, Isaiah.
Hi.
Hi. Are you okay? You need some water?
No.
A day after being taken from their parents' custody, a large lump is discovered on the abdomen of the child that now sits on the stand to testify. Isaiah tells the court that whilst he was under the care of his parents, he had told them and his siblings many times about this large bump that bothered him very much. He states that he was never taken to a doctor or a medical expert to investigate what it may be. The parents claim that the bump wasn't large at all when the child was living under their care, and seem very surprised at their son's testimony. This confusion can be most prominently seen on Therian's face, as her husband questions the boy about the size of it.
Could you describe it with your hands?
Like this?
Can you lift your hands up a little bit higher so we can see, Isaiah? Lift them up high. All right, thank you.
Going across your abdomen? Going across your stomach?
When you were at home, did you throw up?
Yes.
When do you remember throwing up at home?
7. When I was 7.
Do you remember being sick at home?
Yes.
And how were you sick?
I just kept on throwing up.
You threw up at home? Okay. Did you throw up in your bed, or where'd you throw up?
In the bathroom.
Okay. Do you remember Mommy asking you about that bump on your tummy?
No.
Do you remember Mommy let me change my question. Do you remember Mommy asking you if that bump bothers you?
Yes.
Do you remember Mommy asking you if the bump hurt you?
No.
Do you remember when you took a bath that Mommy always asked you about, does this bump bother you?
No.
You don't remember? Been a long time. Do you remember scratching like this?
Yes.
And what side was the bump on when you were at home? Was it on both sides or just one side?
Both.
It was on both sides?
Can you answer out loud for me, Isaiah, please?
Yes.
Using your tummy, how big this was? Was it just over here or just over here? Or was it all the way across?
All the way across.
It was all the way across? Okay.
Can you give me your answer out loud, please, Isaiah?
The bump is an abdominal tumor caused by a very rare form of skin cancer and had been growing for many years. The medical expert who examined Asaya would go on to say that this tumor was the most extensive that he had ever seen, and if treated earlier, would have been a very simple surgery with an almost 100% rate of success after the first operation. Because it was left so late, it was going to take multiple surgeries now to remove, and even with treatment, has the possibility to take the boy's life. This leads us into the closing arguments, and the legally inexperienced, self-representing parents would have an opportunity to present first.
Dr. Ash could not identify a diagnosis with any medical certainty that Recardo Jr. had suffered mental pain due to an alleged lack of mental stimulation and social interaction, as in fact he received both daily from his parents. I'll call this reasonable doubt for counts 1 and 3. I hope I haven't put you to sleep, because now I'd like to ask you not only for a verdict of, let me get it right this time, not guilty, but that you let Yah's people go so that they serve him. I assert that we are not guilty of all 7 counts of this indictment. So please, I request of you that you let Yah's people go. Thank you.
Throughout the case, the inexperience of the defendants was rather obvious, as they fumbled with objections and had trouble with relevant questioning. Their closing statements really highlighted this inexperience with a short and unfocused presentation to the jury that didn't really say much other than, "We aren't guilty because we aren't guilty." This case would have been a pretty difficult one for even an experienced defense attorney, and watching the prosecution present a scathing closing argument juxtaposed against the defense's rambling mess is quite a sight to see.
He suffered muscle atrophy that caused him pain. He suffered bone disease. He suffered a fungus growing on his skin because he did not shower or bathe for months and was never even given clean clothes. He suffered mental pain, and that's proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Sadness, loneliness, extreme boredom is painful. In the future, he will suffer mental pain because of what these defendants did. He will struggle with relationships. Who takes a 12-year-old son and puts them in that position without malice? Who changes their life so dramatically in such a short period of time that you don't know it, that you don't know what you're doing, that you don't know the likely outcome of what you're doing to that child? This was his life. That's it. You see his entire life for months on that screen. He had nothing else. Pride. Let's talk about the words that she put on his wall. Pretentious? Who's pretentious? There's pretentious. There's, I've got all the answers, and I can do what I want with my children. That's pretentious. Putrid? Putting your child in an environment where fungus grows on the skin is sickening and it's putrid. Ruin 2 of their children's lives. Ignorance. They want to tell you how smart they are. And they did tell you all about their degrees, and they're ignorant. How are they ignorant? Ricardo was in a swimming pool on the shallow end, and he, like all kids, are growing up. And guess what? He, like the best of us, don't want to spend our lives in the shallow end. We grow in the swimming pool of life when we go to the deep end. That's how we all grow. If we didn't do that, we would all still be 12. But Ricardo made a mistake because she said, "You want me to help you on the deep end?" And he said no. And what's the one thing you never do in that house? Tell Mom no. He told her he didn't need any help. And he tried it on his own. And guess what? Like all of us, sometimes it works for us, and sometimes stepping out doesn't. So yeah, she needed to save him. But she was mad at him and called it prideful that he was trying to develop himself further. And that is such a key story here. The key story is that they are under her thumb, and they can't do anything without her. That's what life in that house was like. Exile. Who exiles their own child? Only evil does that. Only evil, not Ricardo. Only evil does that. These are her words. But they don't apply to Ricardo, they apply to her. He was 12. Those are his parents. Who convinced him that he deserved to rot in a blue small prison cell for months? Who convinced him that that was right? The only people that ever communicated with him convinced him that that's the right thing to do to a 12-year-old, and they're blaming it on him. Defendants want to try to convince you that this was a happy home. And it's a happy home if you ignore somebody dying of cancer. And it's a happy home as long as you don't talk about the pink elephant in the room. And nobody talked about the pink elephant in the room. Only it wasn't a pink elephant. It was a 12-year-old stuck in a blue room. So as long as everybody ignored that, it was a happy home. And that's what they taught their children to live home life like. Ricardo and Isaiah will pay the price for the rest of their lives in one form or another. There's only one verdict that will speak the truth. Guilty on all charges.
Both parents are found guilty on 3 of the 7 charges of child abuse and are sentenced to 20 years in prison each, with another 10 on probation. During the sentencing of the 2, the judge had some final words to say which really struck a chord with me.
There is not a parent in this room, there is not a parent in this world that is perfect. But as parents, we need to tread lightly with the responsibility that we have. What has been a key theme throughout the evidence in the trial of this case is what is reasonable and what is not reasonable. And being entrusted with that precious gift of being a parent, having life experience, financial resources, the educational background that each of you have, that light bulb never came on for you as to where that line of reasonableness should have been drawn. And you far exceeded anything that could possibly be considered reasonable in your treatment. Children have an uncanny ability to be resilient, to be malleable, to be adaptable, and that's even more heartbreaking in this case because your oldest child adapted to those unreasonable, inhumane, and unlawful circumstances that were imposed on him. Children have a gift that is an uncanny gift for unconditional love and forgiveness. Yet you came to the decision that your child did not deserve forgiveness for taking food, a book, a DVD player. For that, he no longer deserved to be forgiven by his parents. That is incomprehensible. The sentence that I'm going to impose is going to be the same sentence for each defendant.
It baffles me that academics such as these 2, who attained high levels of education, would engage in behavior such as this. In a court hearing prior to the trial, Therian claims that she chose to have a miscarriage at home with no medical care, and that some of her children had witnessed this lifeless child being born. They all named the child Daniel, and he was buried in their backyard, although Therian states that none of her children had helped with the burial. In addition to this, the Wimbushes wrote a letter to the DA office a few months before trial. The letter had asked the charges to all be dropped, and also requested $500 million in restitutionary redress. After the sentencing, the parents are not allowed to have any contact with the children until they are 21, and that contact must be initiated by the children. Ricardo Sr. regrets his actions and has said in an interview that he loves each of his children more than anything, and that he accepts responsibility for the harm he caused. He hopes that one day he can be reunited with them all. He disclosed that he could have taken a plea deal to testify against his wife, but he chose not to. He said that they're both partners in parenting, that they are a team, and even though she called the majority of the shots, he could have put a stop to it at any time. I have many personal thoughts and opinions on this case, far too many to summarize into the ending here, but I will try capture the ones that sit at the front of my mind in this moment. Most of my thoughts do relate to the mother Therian, likely because she did most of the questioning and talking throughout the trial, and her husband was more of a silent supporter in the background. In my opinion, Therian has a lot of issues with control. I'm not one to claim that another is a narcissist, but she did exhibit traits of it. A point of interest that stood out to me was that in her first 2 days of court, she wore a prison outfit to trial, and her hair wasn't done. She looked like a prisoner, and she questioned her tortured son, Ricardo Jr., in a way that I couldn't help but to feel she was trying to punish him some more, to show him, look what you have done to us, look what you have done to the family. Then the next day, when Ricardo Jr. was no longer to be on stand, she was dressed up in smart attire. No more prison outfit. No more image of suffering. It is a small nitpick, but it did stand out to me. Another point that stood out was Therian's face as she told Ricardo Jr. that she loved him.
That's all I have. Thank you so much. I love you, handsome.
She's looking down as she says it, and doesn't look back to him throughout her words, nor does she wait for his response before she leaves. He says that he loves her back, but she didn't wait around for him to say it. This was not the same treatment that she gave her other children. I can't help but to feel as though she despises Ricardo Jr., and this comes through with her saying that he doesn't deserve forgiveness, the window being spray painted over. Everything she did was to torture him. I can't begin to even comprehend why a mother would feel so much hate towards their own son. To me it looks like she just said that she loved him for the jury, and quickly moved away to show him that he meant nothing to her. I do agree with the prosecutor's closing statements, that she needed control over this family, and to have a son that wasn't under her control would have driven her insane. What does one do with that? You lock him in the basement until he learns to be controlled. It's despicable. It also seemed as though she was more focused on showing the jury what a loving mother she is, rather than focusing on the task at hand, which in a courtroom is defending oneself at all costs. With each forced smile and twisted expression of confusion when her children didn't answer in the way she wanted them to, it felt like one more nail in the coffin of her failing argument. And speaking of her argument, my thoughts now turn towards her opening statement, where she said that it is easier to believe a lie than it is to believe the truth. I really don't understand this, and can't imagine anyone of the jury would either. The circumstances, whether one believes a lie or the truth, would be completely reliant on the factors that surround the context of said lie or truth. What it sounds like to me is that Therian is used to being able to spin stories in any way that she wishes, applying mental gymnastics to confuse her children whilst speaking with enough conviction that they have no other choice but to believe her words. I think that she is so used to controlling children all under the age of 15 that she now has a false belief that she can control anyone in this manner. It was rather interesting watching her treat the jury as though they were her children. She tried to win them over with emotion rather than fact, tried to sway them into recognizing that she is such a loving mother with a beautiful family, and that she had no other choice to protect them all from this horrible son that is Ricardo Jr. Even after being taken from her care, she still tries to throw Ricardo Jr. under the metaphorical bus. She attempts to show the jurors what a naughty, awful boy he was, one that lied and stole and even molested. And then she goes on to show them how patient and loving and understanding she is, that she gave him every chance possible to reform. I believe this case was always going to swing in the state's favor, but watching her attempt to manipulate these adults into believing her narrative, rather than focusing on the facts of the case, really didn't do her any favors. Ricardo Jr., by all accounts, sounded like a normal child, figuring out his own boundaries and exploring the world that he had at his fingertips. As the eldest sibling, it breaks my heart to think that at each moment where he could have chose to explore his surroundings, he was beaten and ridiculed. He displayed a strong sense of spirit as he tried to find creative ways around these oppressive rules that were placed on him, and when caught, he showed more spirit by getting creative with his lies. He chose to lie not because of pride or being a rotten child. He lied because he didn't want to sacrifice his own life to fit into the mental box that his parents were forcing him into. She attempted to beat him into submission, and when the beatings didn't work, when she couldn't force him into that mental prison, she locked him into a physical one. Everything she did was designed to break this child's spirit, and if she could break the eldest, then he would be a shining example to encourage her other children never to act out. The most heartbreaking part of this is that to a degree, she did break him. To survive the hell that was thrust upon him, he needed to sacrifice a part of his curious mind, the part that made him want to live, so that he could survive down there. There's extensive testimony from the psychologist who evaluated Recardo Jr., and he said that something which is present in Recardo's personality now is that he does not value his own entertainment or growth. The psychologist says that he doesn't ask for anything. He doesn't think about what anyone else is thinking either. He would be asked many times through interviews, "Have you thought about why I'm asking you all of these questions?" No. Do you ever wonder what your parents were thinking when they put you downstairs? No. Do you wonder what your new life will be like? No. This is dangerous for him, as the boy will be highly prone to exploitation as life progresses. The psychologist says that he will just go along with whatever anyone tells him, and he will never question anything. And worst of all, at the time of this trial, when Recardo Jr. was 16, he would go back to being locked in the closet if it meant that his family would be back together and his parents would be out of jail. I don't know where these children will end up, and I don't know if Recardo Jr. will ever be able to recover from that abuse. I don't know if the cancer will claim Isaiah's life, or if the other children will ever recognize exactly what their parents did to them all. I hope, with all that I have, that they will be okay, that they'll find their way and the world will be kind to them. Children rely on their parents for so much, and because of this, a parent can be their most loving support or their worst nightmare. If this video ever were to make its way to Recardo Jr. or his siblings, for what it's worth, I truly hope you are all doing well, and know in your hearts that none of this, your family splitting up, your parents going to jail, was ever any of your fault.